Before we get into that, we need to talk about just one particular thing in genetics.
Okay.
And that is, what is a gene? What is a piece of DNA? What is a genome?
Now, a quick primer on DNA. I suspect that not everybody in the audience is a geneticist. It is a very long linear molecule, a coded version of how to make another copy of you. It's your blueprint. It's composed of 4 subunits, A, C, G, and T, we call them, and it's the sequence of those subunits that defines that blueprint. How long is it? Well, it's billions of these subunits in length. A haploid genome, we actually have 2 copies of all of our chromosomes. Haploid genome is around 3.2 billion nucleotides in length, and that whole thing, if you add it all together, is over 6 billion nucleotides long. If you take all the DNA out of one cell in your body and stretch it end to end, it's around 2 meters long. If you take all the DNA out of every cell in your body and you stretch it end to end, it would reach from here to the moon and back thousands of times. It's a lot of information.
This is a picture of a person's genome. This is the part of the genome that's inside the nucleus that's inside our cells.
And so when you're copying this DNA molecule to pass it on, it's a pretty tough job. Imagine the longest book you can think of, War and Peace, and now multiply it by 100. And imagine copying that by hand. And you're working away until late at night, and you're very, very careful, and you're drinking coffee, and you're paying attention, but occasionally, when you're copying this by hand, you're going to make a little typo, a spelling mistake. Substitute an I for an E, or a C for a T. Same thing happens to our DNA as it's being passed on through the generations. It doesn't happen very often. We have a proofreading mechanism built in. But when it does happen, and these changes get transmitted down through the generations, they become markers of descent. If you share a marker with someone, it means you share an ancestor at some point in the past, the person who first had that change in their DNA.
Okay.
The part that we need to focus on to talk about Eve is a piece of DNA that's only inherited from your mother. But it's not in the nucleus of the cell. It's actually outside in a little organelle called the mitochondrion. And the mitochondrial DNA controls the conversion of sugars into energy. And so you have in each cell you have about 100 little mitochondria, and they're little energy factories producing energy for us to live and breathe and think and things like that. And according to theory, and according to a lot of experimental evidence, you only get that from your mother. And it's critical because that means that what we can do is we can take all the mitochondrial DNA in the world and look at them, compare them, and then build a family tree of all the women. And that family tree points back to a single female.
Wow.
But that little piece of DNA has been used to develop what's called the out of Africa theory. This is a chart from the original paper that came out in 1987. It's very complicated looking, but if you look on the very bottom, on the right, there's a group of sequences there. They only come from Africa. And they're very different from the sequences in the rest of the world. In fact, here, I'll circle the African sequences.
Okay. Those are only in Africa?
Those are only in Africa. But there are also some sequences from Africa that are found that are similar to the other ones also.
Everybody in this room, everybody in the world, falls into a lineage somewhere on these trees. Now, even though these are simplified versions of the real trees, they're still kind of complicated, so let's simplify them, turn them on their sides, combine them so that they look like a tree with the root at the bottom and the branches going up. What's the take-home message? Well, the thing that jumps out at you first is that the deepest lineages in our family trees are found within Africa, among Africans. That means that Africans have been accumulating this mutational diversity for longer. And what that means is that we originated in Africa. It's written in our DNA. Every piece of DNA we look at has greater diversity within Africa than outside of Africa.
Now, the evolutionary assumption here is that an old population will accumulate a lot of mutations over time.
Sure.
So they looked at that and they said, oh, they made an inference. That quote there, we infer that Africa is the likeliest source of the human mitochondrial gene pool. Because there are 2 big branches here, that word ancestor. That word ancestor there. There are 2 big branches. To the right or to the bottom is one branch that leads only to Africa, and to the top, other African sequences. They assumed that over time, all these mutations accumulated in Africa. And then one branch arose, and that one branch escaped Africa and spread out across the rest of the world.
Okay. At some point in the past, a subgroup of Africans left the African continent to go out and populate the rest of the world.
That's where that comes from. This chart, though, has some assumptions behind it. I want to point that out for the audience. The biggest assumption behind most molecular studies in evolution is called the molecular clock. It's the belief that mutations accumulate at the same rate in all populations. But that depends upon several things. It means that the generation time has to be the same amongst all cultures. It means that they have to have the same number of children. The children have to have the same death rate. The population has to be about equivalent in size. And there can't be any mutations that affect the workings of the DNA repair enzymes. If someone has a defective DNA repair enzyme, they'll accumulate more mutations.
Sure.
And so there can't be any population differences in any of these things. If those things are satisfied, then maybe out of Africa is true. But every single one of those has been questioned, even in the evolutionary literature. Well, I have listed here 3 different papers that have specifically questioned the molecular clock in Africa. They're saying there are some African branches that are this big and some are this big, and they say the molecular clock doesn't work. Also, there is abundant evidence that natural selection occurs amongst mitochondrial lines. If you think about someone who lives in Siberia, you might get a very strong selective force saying you have to have very efficient mitochondria or you're going to die because it's cold up there. Well, if natural selection occurs, the assumption now under molecular mitochondrial clock is if you've got 2 people and they're separated by maybe 20 mutations, that the ancestor's right in the middle, 10 mutations from either side. But if natural selection is occurring, it drives differences, and this person might accumulate more mutations than the other, and all of a sudden you don't know where the ancestor is. So we can't build a beautiful tree with a root in Africa if any of these things are happening. Now, it's important for us to know, but there's more. If there's a problem with the DNA repair enzyme, a person is going to accumulate more mutations over their life. And we know that there are people like that that exist. And if there's a difference between 2 populations, either a defective or a different DNA repair system, it's going to drive the population apart. That's because the DNA naturally breaks and gets repaired every day in your body. But also, Bruce Ames, who's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, he's introduced what he called the genetic triage hypothesis. He's saying that DNA mutation is strongly dependent upon environmental causes. So imagine a population that's under starvation or
Yes.
long-term stress. Well, DNA repair is not necessary for survival. Basic metabolism is. He's saying that if you're under long-term stress, parts of your body shut down, and DNA repair is one of those. So under stress, you accumulate more mutations because you got to live till tomorrow. Who cares if you die of cancer when you're 50?
Right.
So your body turns things off that aren't essential. Well, if that's true, oh man, where's the harshest environment on Earth? Africa is the only major population that spans the equator.
Yes.
India is north of the equator, Australia is south of the equator, and then the equator in South America goes up over the Andes Mountains and then down through the Brazilian rainforest. So currently, in historical times, the only large population spanning the equator was Africa. Even the evolutionists are arguing about the basic fundamental assumptions behind out of Africa. So I'm quite comfortable here introducing some ideas that lead toward out of Babel instead.
Out of Babel instead of out of Africa.
Okay. Next section of the scripture that is a genetic statement, Genesis chapter 7. And Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him went into the ark to escape the waters of the flood. Right after that, Genesis 9, it says, the sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These 3 were the sons of Noah. And from these, the people of the whole earth were dispersed. Okay, wait a minute. Does the Bible there say that all the people on earth came from 3 founding couples? Yeah, that's what it says. That is a very stark statement right there. That's either true or false. I can't think of a way to mush that up and say, oh, he didn't really mean that. It really means this. I can't do that with his words. The words are very plain. If that is true, then we have to explain how that can be true. So let's just think about the ark for a second. How many Y chromosomes were on board the ark? 1. Because Noah gave the same Y chromosome to his 3 sons. There might have been a mutation in there, okay, fine, but generally 1. How many mitochondrial DNAs were on board the ark? I don't know. It depends. What if one of the daughters was actually a daughter of Noah? What if all 3 of them were daughters of Noah? Then there'd be 1. What if one of them was distant related, and the other 2 were closely related? There might be 2. I suspect 3. There might be 4 if Noah's wife had a daughter after the flood. She could have passed on her mitochondrial DNA. And if that was different, but there could have been as few as 1. I suspect 3. The reason I say that is because I've already seen the data. Turns out, first of all, that Y chromosomes across the world are incredibly similar to one another. That was a big shock. Because there's no evidence of common ancestry of the Y chromosomes with the chimpanzee. After they did the chimpanzee genome, several years later, someone redid the Y chromosome. And in the paper they said, wow, that's as much difference as we expected between humans and something like a chicken. But in order to get the common ancestry between humans and chickens, you have to have a common ancestry between mammals and reptiles 300 million years ago. Here's the out of Africa model.
They put the starting point down there in the middle of Africa, even though the center of diversity in Africa is in Ethiopia.
As you go away from the Middle East, in any country in the world, any direction across the world, genetic diversity decreases because fewer and fewer people made it the further away we go. So less genes were carried to the extremes, to the point where the most homogeneous populations in the world are amongst Native Americans. But that's also true in Africa. As you travel south in Africa or west in Africa, genetic diversity decreases.
They call it a serial dilution, because as people spread out across the world, it took generations to get to the ends of the earth. And as a people group moved to here, and some of those people moved to there, and some of those people moved to there, and some of those people moved to there, less and less genes got to the ends. But when we see the pattern in the world, when we look at Africa, we see a similar pattern. The center of origin must have been up in Ethiopia. Oh, that's right next to the Middle East. Statistically, you can't tell the difference between the genetic diversity there. So the starting point is somewhere, scientifically, somewhere in a circle.
Up in here, man, that's right next to where we think the Tower of Babel is. In fact, it's very difficult to tell the difference between these two spots.
Oh, but they don't want you to know that.
So the only real difference is where you put the pin for the place where it started.
Yeah, and it depends upon your assumptions
And
about
it's
what
the
happened in the
assumptions
past.
that you're making. That's fascinating.
So here's the world. This is what the Bible says.
Yeah.
That at the Tower of Babel, God separated the nations according to language. He used language to separate them, and they spread out across the world. And that is exactly what modern genetics has discovered. A single dispersion of people across the face of the planet. Well, there are a whole lot of different creation stories from people all over the world. What's the chance that the ancient Hebrews hit the nail on the head?
Now, how recently did we share this ancestry? Was it millions of years ago? Which we might suspect by looking at all this incredible variation around the world. No, the DNA tells a story that's very clear. Within the last 200,000 years, we all share an ancestor, a single person, mitochondrial Eve, you might have heard about her, in Africa, an African woman who gave rise to all the mitochondrial diversity in the world today. But what's even more amazing is that if you look at the Y chromosome side, the male side of the story, the Y chromosome Adam only lived around 60,000 years ago. That's only about 2,000 human generations, the blink of an eye in an evolutionary sense. That tells us we were all still living in Africa at that time. This was an African man who gave rise to all the Y chromosome diversity around the world. It's only within the last 60,000 years that we have started to generate this incredible diversity we see around the world. Such an amazing story. We're all effectively part of an extended African family.
You don't need many people to explain almost all of the world's genetic diversity. Do you know what that means? That means the diversity that we find is spread everywhere on Earth, meaning the diversity must have existed before we spread out. The evolutionist says, out of Africa, I say out of Babel. And the things that we find spread out all around the world, they should have been at Babel, they would have been on the ark, those are the things that would have been in Adam. The things we don't find spread out around the world, red hair, blue eyes, sickle cell anemia, light skin, those are mutations that happen after the fact. In fact, some people are estimating that blonde hair is less than 1,000 years old. And the distribution of blonde hair in the world directly parallels the Viking invasions of the Middle Ages. This one here, Genesis chapter 10. These are the clans of the sons of Noah, according to their genealogies. in their nations, and from these the nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood. You know what this is right here? This is the key to understanding modern human genetics. Because at the Tower of Babel, God separated the nations according to Y chromosome, not mitochondrial DNA. And those families that got scrambled, God resorted them, but He only sorted them according to Y chromosome. What happened to the mitochondria, the 3 daughters? All mixed in amongst all the different groups of people. And so what we see is, first of all, Y chromosomes have little variation, but a prediction is that the variations now that have occurred should be geographically specific, and that is absolutely true. They were sequencing, they're looking at Y chromosome diversity in England. They're just trying to see how much diversity was in England. They sequenced all these men's DNA, and they found one that was really weird, and they said, wait a minute, that belongs in southern Africa. What on earth is it doing here? So they wrote the guy and said, excuse me, sir, do you have any African heritage? He's like, no, I'm English. And so they wrote every man with that last name in England. Cool. And a lot of them agreed to participate in their study. They built a family tree for the men. It all went back, and they all went back to a man who lived in the middle of the 1700s. And all of those men that today had the same Y chromosome from Africa. But wait a minute. Now I'm going to be politically incorrect here. There are a lot of European Y chromosomes spread out all over the world, a legacy of the colonial era. There are incredibly few black and brown Y chromosomes found in old European lines because the gene flow went one direction, not the other. White girls did not have children with non-Europeans, but white men had lots of children with non-Europeans. Okay? Fact of history. This African Y chromosome in the 1700s in England is too early. The colonial era hadn't been around that long. It was too early for a white woman to be impregnated by an African man, and then the African man's child, who had been half black, had to marry another white woman until it got to the point where the sons being born weren't dark anymore. It would take 3 or 4 generations. But you know, the Romans had an African legion manning Hadrian's Wall on the border of Scotland. What if, and you know what soldiers do. In fact, after the 150s or so, Roman soldiers were allowed to get married. They weren't allowed before that. And that's Hadrian's Wall era. And it's quite possible that one of those Roman Africans had an African Y chromosome and left his DNA there in England and is still there today. History is awesome.
Okay, some things that we have to know. First of all, mutations accumulate very quickly in small populations. Now here's the most extreme example I could think of. A population of 2 individuals, and every generation are only 2 individuals. So generation after generation after generation, 2 people, all the way through forever. If one of those people pops up with a new mutation, such as this green-faced person. Now he's not completely green because, remember, we have 2 chromosomes. So one of the chromosomes is defective, the other one still works, he's only half green. Well, there's a chance that he's not going to pass on that mutation to his children, and the green mutation will just disappear. But there's another chance that he'll pass the mutation to both of his children. If that happens, well, maybe they can pass 2 copies to each of the children. All of a sudden, the red mutation, the red face, not the non-mutant gene, the red face gene, is gone. So in small populations, you can get a rapid changes. And actually, it's usually very bad because of inbreeding. Inbreeding is bad because you get a rapid fixation of new mutations. So what does that mean for Africa? There's a paper that came out in 2008. And in this scientific paper, appeared in the American Journal of Human Genetics, they quoted early human populations evolved separately for 100,000 years. What does that mean? It means that they're talking about Africa here because they believe Africa is the earliest. They're saying that the African population was divided up into small groups of people, and they stayed separate and small for a very long time. Wait a minute. Under those conditions, you would expect them to diverge rapidly. You would expect new mutations to come, the populations themselves to spread out very quickly. That might explain why Africa has so much diversity in it. Africa has more genetic diversity than the rest of the world put together. In fact, all of Europe has about as much genetic diversity as one African tribe.
Wow.
And two people living near each other from different cultural groups in Africa can be more different from one another as a European is from someone from China.
Wow.
It's huge. The assumption, though, is that everything across the world has always happened at the same rate, and I question that assumption.
Some data that I made, and this is actually, for me, fascinating. I'm going to try to convince you this is fascinating also. The program that I used took A, T, G, and C and replaced the letters with a colored dot. So 4 colors for the 4 letters. Each row is an individual from Europe. Each column is a specific letter in the genome. And each column, in this data set, they sampled about every 1,000th letter in the genome. They looked at 1,300 people. Okay, now wait. The reason I do this is because I'm now going to show you the same exact section of DNA in one African tribe from Nigeria, the Yoruba.
Oh, wow.
Europe, one tribe in Africa. Europe, one tribe in Africa. That is what we have to explain. I'm working on this right now. I'm filling up my hard drive with data. But this data set, I am crunching through it like crazy because I think what's happening here is, see all the scrambling that's happening here? Let's go back here. You see this piece of DNA right here? Obviously that's like a cassette, right? You have this or that. And you can have, like, this person, actually, 2 stripes together is one person's chromosome they got from their mother and one they got from their father. So they're actually in pairs. This is person number 1, person number 2, person number 3, person number 4. So look right here, I don't know who is who here, but there's at least 3 lines there. That means that this one of these people here, they got identical copies from their mother and their father in a cassette. Let's look at this piece here. That is an ancestral block of DNA. All those genes you inherit together until a recombination happens. And look right here. Look, it goes like this and stops. See that? A recombination event happens somewhere in that person's ancestry, where you had this ancestral piece of DNA and this ancestral piece of DNA, and they crossed over in one of the parents. And what the result was is half of type 1 and half of type 2, and that person inherited that right there. There's one there, they're all over the place actually. See these little dots? If the only, I shouldn't go in there, that's my new study. I don't think that is a product of recombination. I'm troubled by this, or was troubled by this, because if that's just recombination, it would take hundreds of thousands of generations to produce that much scrambling from Adam and Eve. I think I have got a great handle on it, and I'm going to put down my microphone. I'm going to show you an illustration with my fingers. DNA is a double helix, right? You have 2 copies of each chromosome, right? Well, during cell division, during meiosis, the chromosomes line up, they can recombine, and then they separate, and the resulting chromosome that you pass on to your child is 1/2 of your father's and 1/2 of your mother's, or 1/3 of your father's and 2/3 of your mother's, depending on where they crosses over. However, DNA is funny. Because these 2 things are like 99.99% identical, this can happen. And when that happens, DNA repair enzymes sliding down what they think is a chromosome say, wait a minute, there's an A here and a T here. There's a mistake, and it fixes one of them. And then when they do this, when the cell actually divides, another DNA repair enzyme, wait a minute, there's a T here, and it fixes one of them. And you can copy a single letter from here to here. It's called gene conversion. And the more diversity you have in a population, the more gene conversion you have. These dots, that's not because there's a crossing over event here and 1,000 generations of a crossing over event there, so only that little thing got left over. That's a gene conversion event. And so what I'm doing now is I am mapping conversions. I figured out how to do it using this data. I'm very excited. But for 3 weeks I've been trying to prove that these aren't sequencing errors. And that's hard. But if I can do that, I'm definitely going to publish it. So these are ancestral blocks that get scrambled through recombination and conversion to do that. But since there's not much diversity in the Europeans, you get these big old sections. I think we can explain Africa. All we have to do is have more people get to Africa after Tower of Babel. And that's what's going to happen naturally.
A rock shelter in the Libyan desert. The site of an unprecedented discovery. A tiny mummified child. Until the moment he was unearthed, everyone thought the Egyptians had invented mummification in Africa. But this discovery led Dr. Savino Delernia and his team to develop a new theory which challenges everything we thought we knew about ancient Egypt.
Mummification knowledge wasn't born in Egypt, but in another place, in another culture, in another part of the history of the Africa.
It was this child who would prove to be the key to unlocking a long-lost African culture. It all began 40 years ago with the discovery of the little mummified boy, Juan Mahujaj. He took his name from the rock shelter where he was found. When a small sack came to light, no one was prepared for what it contained. Soon after he died, this young boy was put in a fetal position, then embalmed and placed in a sack made of antelope skin. The sack was then insulated by a layer of leaves. Incisions were made along his stomach and thorax. Then his organs were removed, and an organic preservative inserted to stop his body from decomposing. And it was this process which put the Black Mummy on the world stage. Academics, like mummy expert and Egyptologist Dr. Joanne Fletcher, were intrigued. Juan Mahujaj was artificially mummified 1,500 miles to the west of the Nile Valley.
NASA scientists were looking at images of the Western Desert as an analogy of their studies of the Martian surface, and they were looking at it with using radar instruments and comparing those with more conventional satellite images. And they discovered a whole series of buried river networks underneath what is now a sand sheet.
The radar penetrated the desert surface to reveal an ancient system of river channels that once fed into vast lakes. These lakes dried up long ago and are now what the scientists call paleo lakes. Kevin White is using this technique to uncover similar channels in Libya's central Sahara.
This is a paleo lake. We know people were living here around about the time of Juan Mahujaj because we found pottery and stone tools from around that period.
Taking the route up.
Nick and Savino are colleagues. They're heading for a dry riverbed a few hours from the Juan Mahujaj rock shelter. Matendouche is one of the most famous rock art sites in Africa.
There's a lot of animals. There is the elephant and 2 or 3 giraffes with a lot of superimpositions. Yeah, it's quite complex. But the giraffe is really impressive. It's very well done. And
Shame it's lost its nose, but it's still pretty good.
yeah, my favorite is the one on the corner, just with the. I think it's a masterpiece of the rock art in the Wadi Matendouche area.
Absolutely. Oh yeah, I think we found the giraffe's nose down here.
Really?
It looks like it, yeah.
Yeah, you're right.
So there we go.
Yeah, you're right.
It hasn't gone far. Enigmatic figure.
Yeah.
All the animals depicted here live only in savannas, but it was the next carving that completed the picture for Nick.
This is one of the most famous rock art engravings here in Wadi Matendouche. It's the representation of a crocodile.
It's really spectacular, and we know that things like elephants and giraffe and some of the other big animals can live in quite dry environments, not as dry as we've got here today.
Yeah.
But this is really the final proof. This was a river, you know. Crocodiles don't live in arid environments.
Yeah, absolutely. So.
Walking down the streets of present-day Libya, I'm always struck by the incredible diversity of humanity that one encounters, and that reflects broadly the sort of crossroads position of Libya within the Mediterranean with its Saharan hinterland. Libya's been a great melting pot.
This ethnic diversity explains some intriguing rock art that initially puzzled Savino.
The face of these people are not black as Juan Mahujaj. but they are white. And you can see this looking at the profile of the face and to the style.
It is this mixed-race culture which mummified Juan Mahujaj. But what kind of society did this young boy live in? One important clue is the ostrich eggshell necklace that he was still wearing, unbroken, when he was first discovered.
We still have some few beads of a necklace of ostrich eggshells.
In ancient societies, the inclusion of grave goods indicated ritual and ceremony. And the mummification process suggested something else. Even though Juan Mahujaj is the only complete Saharan mummy ever found, these people had been mummifying their dead for hundreds, if not thousands of years before the boy died.
The thing about the black mummy is the very sophisticated form of evisceration. The black mummy is obviously almost the end result of a very complex development in this very highly skilled procedure.
The mummy of Juan Mahujaj, we can say, was not particularly rich or particularly powerful. The fact is that this kind of pastoral society were quite egalitarian in their social organization.
The fact that this is a very small child that's been mummified with a great deal of care and attention suggests that this is a society which doesn't necessarily judge individuals by their achievements. So the fact that people were obviously mummifying the children, presumably in the hope that they would live again in some form of afterlife, can, I think, tell us a great deal about those responsible. There's obviously a great deal of compassion and love that would have gone into such a procedure, and a desire perhaps to keep the dead child with one at all times.
In the 1980s, French archaeologists uncovered pottery, human burials, and rock art, which were all almost exactly the same as the evidence found in Libya by the Italians. And similar artifacts were found throughout North Africa. It looked like this culture was far more widespread than anyone had ever imagined.
So we have just here Tripoli, we have here Cairo and the Nile, and just in the center we have the Caucasus Mountains. And we have Algeria, Libya, Egypt, and Sudan, and Chad, and Niger, and Mali. So this area is bigger than Europe, so it means that all this very, very large extent was inhabited during ancient times by the same ancient African Saharan culture.
The size of this culture was extraordinary. It spanned most of North Africa, from Mali to the western fringes of Egypt itself.
That seems so recent. Why didn't we start to leave earlier? Why didn't Homo erectus evolve into separate species, or subspecies rather, human races around the world? Why was it that we seem to have come out of Africa so recently? Well, that's a big question. These why questions, particularly in genetics and the study of history in general, are always the big ones, the ones that are tough to answer. And so, when all else fails, talk about the weather. What was going on to the world's weather around 60,000 years ago? Well, we were going into the worst part of the last ice age. Lots of evidence from sediment cores and the pollen types, oxygen isotopes, and so on. Basically, things were getting really tough, getting very cold. The northern hemisphere had massive growing ice sheets. New York City, Chicago, Seattle, all under a sheet of ice, most of Britain, all of Scandinavia, covered by ice several kilometers thick. Now, Africa is the most tropical continent on the planet. About 85% of it lies between Cancer and Capricorn. And there aren't a lot of glaciers here, except on the high mountains here in East Africa. So what was going on here? We weren't covered in ice in Africa. Rather, Africa was drying out at that time. This is a paleoclimatological map of what Africa looked like between 60 and 70,000 years ago, reconstructed from all these pieces of evidence that I mentioned before. The reason for that is that ice actually sucks moisture out of the atmosphere. If you think about Antarctica, it's technically a desert. It gets so little precipitation. So the whole world was drying out. The sea levels were dropping. And Africa was turning to desert. The Sahara was much bigger then than it is now. And the human habitat was reduced to just a few small pockets compared to what we have today. The evidence from genetic data is that the human population around this time, roughly 70,000 years ago, crashed to fewer than 2,000 individuals. We nearly went extinct. We were hanging on by our fingernails.
Here's a jar full of marbles. That represents genetic diversity. If only a few people survive, and then that little cup there that's only got a couple of yellows and a couple of blues, that right there is the ancestor of all people today because everybody else died off. When the population regrows, you're going to lose most of the genetic diversity that was there initially. That's this out of Africa theory right there. The reason the way they explain the lack of diversity in people, population bottleneck.
And then something happened. Great illustration of it. Look at some stone tools. The ones on the left are from Africa, from around 1 million years ago. The ones on the right were made by Neanderthals living in Europe, and they date from around 50 or 60,000 years ago.
A lot of creationists write about an ice age that they believe happened after the flood. This is the time frame of the ice age. In fact, Europe was covered in ice when ancient Europeans started migrating into Europe. It was one of the last places on Earth actually settled because it was covered in ice. And then, of course, the early Europeans got wiped out by people who looked like me because we came in there with farming and knocked out all the other people, interbred with some of them, which is why all of us have part Neanderthal ancestry. Because they were people living on Earth after the flood, and when my ancestors met them, hey, what do you know, my ancestors were also Neanderthal, just like you. Can you see any area of that chart where there's zero diversity? That reddish and bluish stripe that goes up and down there. All Europeans have exactly the same sequence right there. They lost all the original diversity that might have been at that location. You know how that happened? Inbreeding. All Europeans come from a very small group of people. There's less diversity in Europe than among an average-sized African tribe. It turns out that spot right there is this skin color gene. This is a mutation, and through lots of inbreeding, the original was lost. I think this is an adaptive mutation. Because if my ancestors were pushing up into Europe when it's cold and rainy during the end of the Ice Age, anyone with dark skin would have vitamin D deficiency. Because if you didn't live on the coast, you didn't get fish. If you lived I saw a woman on Bali in Indonesia. She had a goiter. Like, woman, you're 3 miles from the coast, eat some seafood. I was shocked in today's world that there be an example of iodine deficiency. So think about your ancestors now. Vitamin D, that's iodine, but vitamin D is very important. And if you don't have seafood rich in vitamin D, you need sunlight. And so I think this right here is actually selection. They killed off all the people dying of vitamin D deficiency.
Now, the risk of offending any paleoanthropologists or physical anthropologists in the audience, basically, there's not a lot of change between these two stone tool groups. The ones on the left are pretty similar to the ones on the right. We are in a period of long cultural stasis from 1 million years ago until around 60 to 70,000 years ago. The tool styles don't change that much. The evidence is that the human way of life didn't change that much during that period. But then, 50, 60, 70,000 years ago, somewhere in that region, all hell breaks loose. Art makes its appearance. The stone tools become much more finely crafted. The evidence is that humans began to specialize in particular prey species at particular times of the year. The population size started to expand. Probably, according to what many linguists believe, fully modern language, syntactic language, subject, verb, object that we use to convey complex ideas, like I'm doing now, appeared around that time. We became much more social. The social networks expanded. This change in behavior allowed us to survive these worsening conditions in Africa, and they allowed us to start to expand around the world.
So hey, look at this comparison. Evolutionary time. Perhaps 1 million years of Homo erectus living in Africa and South Asia. And for some reason, Homo erectus went through a giant population bottleneck. We got down to an effective population size of approximately 10,000 people. That's the number that Francis Collins quoted. And somehow, while everyone was marrying their sisters and their cousins, which is usually extinction for a species, Homo sapiens evolved during that. And we invented farming and spread out across the world, and then eventually, or we spread out in Africa, and eventually a little group left Africa and covered the rest of the world. But look at the biblical scenario. We have Adam and Eve. We grow to some unknown number before the flood. The population crashes to 3 founding couples. Their children have to marry each other. We increase for a few hundred years, Tower of Babel happens, and we spread out across the world. There is abundant evidence there's been a single dispersal of people across the world in recent history, even for the evolutionist. Tens of thousands of years ago was very recent for an evolutionist. And so they make maps like this. This is an out-of-Africa map based on mitochondrial DNA. But let me just summarize what you're seeing here. You're seeing a single dispersal of people in the recent past traveling into uninhabited territory, turns out with 3 main mitochondrial lineages, in small bands. That's the Tower of Babel story. But it's the Out of Africa story. It's the same story. The data that made them say all those things, but all those things that they say come straight out of Scripture.